Casey, wonder if I could go back to you in talking about knowledge formation and how it's protected and transmitted through Native families. We talked a little bit about ICWA a moment ago. I was wondering if we could go back to that and talk about the development, the history of the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Okay. So to talk about the impetus for the Indian Child Welfare Act, you have to go back in history a little bit further than when the legislation was passed. And you really have to look at the federal policy that was aimed at American Indian families, the way that the federal government set up their assimilation tactics to really try to effectuate the type of change that they were looking for after removal didn't work. Insofar as an agent of assimilation. And the federal government was really grappling with the ideas of how to maintain a landscape where American Indians and non-Indians could live in the same area. The idea was to try to assimilate them through whatever means necessary. So the federal government's assimilation policy began with this boarding school project where the federal government set up boarding schools throughout Indian country. And the boarding schools were not optional. They would come around to Native families and take children out of Native homes and put them in boarding schools to assimilate, to further assist in this assimilation project. So when the children showed up at boarding school, they would be dressed in whatever traditional clothing they had with them. They would be groomed the way that children were groomed in those communities. They would speak their tribal language. They would eat whatever foods were prevalent in their tribal communities. And within just a very few short weeks, those same children would be transformed into completely different people. They would dress the way that non-Indians were expected to dress. They would not be allowed to speak their tribal language. In fact, they'd be punished for speaking their tribal language. They were not allowed to practice their American Indian traditions. They were to shed all aspects of American Indian culture. So the boarding schools were really set up to kill the Indian and save the man. That's a very popular quote used to describe the boarding school era. So even after the federal government stopped operating boarding schools, which was actually a lot later in history than most people understand, but even after the federal government stopped the policy of removing Indian children from Indian families as a means of assimilation by putting them in boarding school, there was still an alarmingly high number of children who were American Indian, who were taken away from their families and who were put in the foster care system. So in the 1970s, advocates from across Indian country started working with Congress to try to address that issue because it was a very alarming issue that so many American Indian children were taken out of American Indian families, placed with non-Indian families, because that was still serving the purpose of assimilation, even though that wasn't the stated purpose of the federal government anymore. So in 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act. And what that legislation does is it creates minimum standards for state courts to follow in dealing with a case that involves an American Indian child. So if there is an American Indian child involved in a case that's being removed from an American Indian parent, there are minimum standards that the state courts have to follow to make sure that those American Indian children are protected in the system. The idea is we want to keep Indian kids with Indian families because it is really trying to address those policies the federal government perpetuated for so long, trying to address the effects of those policies and to protect tribes and tribal communities. So the Indian Child Welfare Act itself provides additional protections for American Indian families, including requiring that states or agencies who remove children have to engage in what's known as active efforts to try to reunify an American Indian child with an American Indian family. The efforts are supposed to be active, not passive, not reasonable, but actually trying to put that Indian family back together. with the heightened sense of urgency given by Congress to really try to keep those families together and not rip them apart like the federal policy had done for so many years. In addition, the act itself requires placement of an Indian child with an Indian child welfare compliant placement with a preference for Indian families. So if a child can't stay with mom or dad for whatever reason, rather than going and being adopted out or put in foster care with a non-Indian family or a non-Indian agency, there's a preference for American Indian providers in that instance. So it does create a lot of protections for Indian families, but you see a lot of mutations from state courts, from our own Supreme Court of the United States, really grappling with how the act is supposed to be implemented. But for the most part, it's seen as a positive thing in Indian country because it's at least an important step towards trying to prevent further assimilation.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge too that these were intentional acts of assimilation. The phenomena was so widespread that it's called the 60s scoop in Canada and the U.S. where kids in 60s and 70s, largely kids were intentionally taken with the purpose of assimilating, which is a violation of the UN Convention on Genocide. Of course, that there's all kinds of fuzzy legal issues regarding that, but it is. I mean, as an international community, we have decided you cannot take children from one group and forcibly assimilate them into another group. And there's been a very long history of that. So it's, like you said earlier, the events of this past year have been greatly upsetting, to a lot of people because it feels like this still going on. And the reaction from the public being that this is some sort of special race-based privilege rather than looking at, or people even having any knowledge of the fact that we've got 565 plus sovereign nations within the border of the U.S. and that there are different legal frameworks that Indian children fall into because of that.
Well, and I mean, understanding the really difficult legal issues that come whenever you're going to do work in Indian country, that's one thing. But just a basic understanding of what every citizen should know as a citizen of the United States, I mean, that's really another thing. And Dr. Shotton's done so much work in that area. But if you ask your students whenever you stand up on the first day to teach class, how many of you know anything about boarding schools? The only kids who are going to raise their hands are the grandchildren or children of boarding school survivors like we are. So they're just not going to have that background. They're not going to have that understanding, and it's difficult to take kids from a place where they just really don't have any understanding of what these issues are and how they impact our communities, and to try to, by the end of the semester, get them gemmed up so that they understand not only the history, because you have to understand the history to understand how it works now, but to not only understand the history, but the way that they can move forward in the future as well. And I know that's work that Dr. Shotton's done quite a bit on.
Well, and I think, too, when we think about those issues, we have to think about how does this affect the broader scope of things, the broader community. So when we take, for example, I hate calling it the baby Veronica case, but when we take the case of Dustin Brown and Veronica Brown, part of the issue with that was that so much of it was played out in the media by people who had no understanding of Native people, of sovereignty issues, of tribal issues, and what was really at hand. So you have this kind of playing out of this being a race-based thing, and when you have sensational talk show hosts that are playing this out and the media playing this out as a race issue, they're missing it altogether. But they're missing it altogether because that kind of education is left out at all levels, K through 12. The larger part of higher education, unless you're taking a Native American Studies course, that information, that type of education is left out. So those people who are making those decisions at the Supreme Court level, those people who are making policies, our congressmen, don't understand. The people who are working in adoption or an Indian child, or having to confront Indian child welfare, an Indian child welfare case, don't have a basic understanding a lot of times because it's just not seen as relevant. So when you ask, if you're in a class and you ask, what do you know about, or know anything about Native boarding schools? It's not considered something that's relevant, although it's a very relevant part of our history, not just as Native people, but as a country.
You know, that's been interesting the last several years in Norman. Non-Native young professionals in our community that are OU graduates tell me that if they could come back to OU and take a class, it would be Intro to Native Studies, because they found themselves working with Native people and Native nations, and they weren't expecting that in their careers when they came through OU in the 90s. And they don't know what they're doing, but they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what questions to ask, and they don't know how to ask them. But I think that that's one of the beautiful things that Native Studies offers. And I tell all of my students, you know, I don't care what your major is. If you're going to work in the state of Oklahoma after you graduate, and we hope that you do, then it would probably be good for you to take a Native Studies course, because you're going to be interacting with Native people and nations no matter what field you're going into. And you really do need this basic knowledge, because we're missing out on a lot of cross-cultural communication that could be extremely beneficial for everyone in this state.
Wado, for that wonderful discussion about Native literature in Oklahoma.